на сцену, а она уже здесь. Это Лили Куо, глава пекинского бюро лучшего британского издания печатного Guardian.
So in 2008, I moved to Beijing to work for a local magazine. China was hosting the Summer Olympics that year. It was supposed to be the country's big coming out moment. The government spent more than $40 billion building stadiums and arenas that looked like contact lenses, birds' nests, and launching chemicals into the sky to make it rain to clear the smog before the games. There was one moment that I remembered particularly from that time. At the opening ceremony, this little girl was singing the national anthem. It soon came out that she was not in fact singing, but lip-syncing to the voice of another girl. This little girl in the background in pink was the actual singer. But this little girl, Yang Pei, 7 years old, her teeth were too crooked to serve the national interest, in the words of the opening ceremony director, for her to be on stage to represent China. So since then, a lot of my work has been trying to figure out what is real and not real about China's influence around the world, and also what is true and not true about the stories that China wants to tell its own citizens. This is the People's Daily, the official voice of the Communist Party, and you will see very prominent photos of President Xi Jinping. And this is also an interesting way to decipher what's happening within the Chinese Communist Party. So there's a lot of focus on this representation of what the government is trying to tell people. So I've been writing about China from 3 main places: Hong Kong, Kenya for Quartz, and now from within China, from Beijing for The Guardian. So I thought today that I would share some of the stories that I've worked on from each of those places and some of the lessons that I've learned. In March 2013, a group of professors in Hong Kong started a group called Occupy Central with Love and Peace. The idea was to use nonviolent civil disobedience to occupying Hong Kong's central business district to call for real democracy in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a former British colony, which was handed back to China in 1997, and according to the terms of the handover, is supposed to operate with a high degree of autonomy. But Beijing has been asserting more and more control over the city. At the time, I really did not pay much attention to this group. I had just moved to Hong Kong, and to me, it was mainly a base to cover China from a big financial hub where not much changed and nobody cared about politics. But then suddenly, in September 2014, thousands of students were swarming the city center, getting tear gassed, and refusing to leave. They were protesting specifically against election rules that did give Beijing vetting power over the candidates in Hong Kong's election. They were joined by more people, much of Hong Kong, including that group of professors that I initially had ignored. In the end, as many as 60,000 people joined what later became known as the Umbrella Movement. They stayed for 79 days. In that time, I learned a few things. First is that a small team can be mighty. I was part of a 2-person office, and we competed, I think, pretty effectively with other publications in Hong Kong that had much bigger staffs. We wrote tons of stories, looking at the role of women in the protest movement, language, the logistics of managing a sit-in for that long, and the time when Kenny G wandered in. He later said that he accidentally walked into the protest when Beijing got mad at him for coming to the protest site. Kenny G is very popular in China. Because we were a small operation and were given the freedom to cover the story how we wanted to, we could work quickly and creatively. Not all of the stories that we did were big, ambitious features. Some of my favorite pieces were very short, like this dispatch on the last night of the protests, before the police would come in the morning and clear everything away. Walking around, I saw one protester writing something in chalk on the ground, and it turned out to be this poem called The Generation. It goes, "The dark night gave me black eyes. I used them to look for light." And the poem was written by an author whose family had been sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution, which was a time of a lot of upheaval and chaos in China. And the poem is thought to be about Chinese youth looking for a better future. That author ended up being exiled from China and lived the rest of his life in New Zealand. The second thing I learned from that experience is not to trust the status quo and assume that things don't or can't change. I assumed that Hong Kong was politically apathetic, and in a way, I think I was also apathetic about how much resistance one can pose to a country as powerful as China. And that is a dangerous way for journalists to think, especially when covering a country like China or other powerful authoritarian regimes. In my last role as a reporter in Kenya, I covered China's presence in Africa. At first, I thought about this mainly in terms of Chinese investment and the role of the Chinese government. So what were the big Chinese state-owned companies doing in Africa, and what would that be good for Africa? What kind of soft power or hard power was China wielding, and how would that affect governance and ideals about democracy on the continent? These are important and interesting questions, but I soon realized that I was more interested in stories happening a little bit closer to the ground, or what one China-Africa researcher described to me as globalization from below. So I looked at the role of Chinese migrant communities in South Africa, trade and business links between Chinese and African entrepreneurs and how that's changing as those links mature. We also looked at the Chinese companies and investors getting involved in African manufacturing, the experience of African traders and migrants in China, and some of those higher level questions too, like how Chinese diplomacy and soft power is struggling in places like South Sudan, or how China is bringing over thousands of African officials and students to train with the Communist Party and other government ministries in a bid to create more sympathy for the Chinese system and likely create places that are more similar to China. The main lesson I took from my time reporting on China and Africa is that it's important to interrogate how you approach your stories. We often wrote about what China is doing to Africa rather than the interaction between places, or how African countries, businessmen and people are also influencing China. And this isn't just a way to seem more egalitarian. Some of China's biggest companies have cut their teeth in Africa and learned lessons that they still apply elsewhere in the world. Others have major African shareholders. Naspers, a South African company, owns almost a third of one of China's largest internet companies, Tencent. In Guangzhou, in southern China, you will find entrepreneurs from Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and Somalia running factories, logistics, services, and other companies that are truly globally connected. And in African countries, more and more, you find Chinese people who never meant to stay there as long as they have, but they say that they can't go home now because being in Africa has changed them too much. I joined the Guardian in March of this year, about 2 weeks after China's National People's Congress passed an amendment abolishing presidential term limits. So this means that China's President Xi Jinping could stay in his role indefinitely. It's a symbolic move because the most powerful roles in China are actually the head of the party and the head of the military. But this does signal a new chapter, one that will and already has made the work of journalists there much harder. Over the last 6 years under Xi, we have seen the space shrinking not just for media, but intellectuals, think tanks, and regular people. When I was last reporting in China in 2013, it was much easier to have honest conversations with experts, professors, and even government officials about the direction of the country. Now we see cases like this professor who was detained in the middle of a live interview, or a group of student activists who were calling for workers' rights in the name of socialism, being arrested in their apartment at 5 in the morning. China recently refused to renew the journalist visa of a reporter for BuzzFeed who had reported extensively on Xinjiang, a territory in northwestern China, where tens of thousands, if not up to 1 million minorities, majority Muslims, have been forced into re-education camps. Here at these re-education camps, they are forced to learn Chinese and pledge allegiance to the Communist Party. Separate from the re-education camps, they are being arrested en masse. Last year, 20% of all arrests in China happened in Xinjiang, an area that accounts for 1.5% of the population. Life isn't much better for those who aren't in the camps or in prison. Minorities in Xinjiang live in fear of being rounded up and detained for offenses like not carrying their ID, praying too much, traveling abroad, or even just getting calls from their relatives and friends abroad. This is one of the few photos that are available from inside the camp. The inmates are reportedly listening to a de-extremification speech in April. And the photo was identified by and confirmed, as far as that can be confirmed, by this group, the Concerned Scholars of Xinjiang. At the same time, even in just the few months that I've been in China, there have been some bright spots. Liu Sha, the wife of the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, has been under house arrest for 8 years. After Liu Xiaobo died last year in police custody, diplomats and activists started lobbying the Chinese government to let her go. They finally did in July. This is her at the airport in Helsinki on her way to Germany, where she now lives. The UN and the US have started criticizing China over what is happening in Xinjiang, and more people, including activists, witnesses, and families here in Kazakhstan, are speaking out. Within China, there are also some forms of resistance. Members of that student group that was arrested have vowed to keep fighting for workers' rights. Chinese women are increasingly speaking out against sexual assault and harassment and forming their own movement. Intellectuals and pockets of China's political elite are reportedly starting to criticize Xi's heavy-handedness. I don't have any great lessons yet from my time in China. I'm still trying to figure out how to report these stories while protecting and respecting the people affected, how to understand what's going on within the black box of the Chinese Communist Party, how to discern what is real and not real about our fears about Chinese companies, technology, and overseas influence. But mostly, I'm trying to remember my own advice to pay attention because things can and do change. And this is Yang Pei, the little girl that didn't get to be on stage at the Olympics. Thank you.
Give me, no, just, yeah, you do not need that anymore. So Lily will take this thing, you know, you need the translation, yeah. Вопросы на самом деле можно задавать на русском языке, на английском, если хотите. Лили сейчас, поэтому я и попросил, чтобы у нас был, да, перевод обеспечен. Пожалуйста, коллеги, у нас есть также время на 15-20 минут на вопросы. Алина, а я вас не вижу. А можно вас спросить, вот начнем с самого конца? Лили, this is for you.
Здравствуйте. Спасибо за интересную лекцию. Меня зовут Дмитрий, я занимаюсь массовыми коммуникациями. Вопрос у меня следующий. Как вы считаете, сколько из вот этих людей, которые приняли ряд этих тяжелых решений об ограничениях, ну, для всей страны, насколько они это делают, потому что они государственники? То есть у нас в Казахстане многие сложные решения оправдываются тем, что человек считает себя государственником, то есть он мыслит не в интересах, допустим, нескольких сот тысяч, не в интересах нескольких десятков людей, а в интересах долгосрочных 30-50-летних страны. То есть человек ради будущего страны горизонтом в 30, 50, 100 лет готов принять здесь и сейчас сложные решения, которые, ну, сделают жизнь многих-многих людей хуже. И вопрос в том, насколько вы верите в существование таких людей сейчас в китайском правительстве, но и насколько они сами себя такими считают. Спасибо.
Дмитрий, и я сразу хочу попросить чуть короче вопросы, если можно. Дальше. Go ahead.
Yes, I think so. So the long-term stability of China does seem to be the justification that the government uses for whatever is happening now. And the first priority is stability, and China does rely on these 5-year plans of what's going to happen in the future. As to the extent that people in the party actually believe that they're working for the long term and the better good of the country, I don't know if they really do believe that. I think some people do. But as the space for criticism and free speech, and I don't mean necessarily media and protesters, but actually just debate within the party has closed, fewer people can actually say what they really think. So before this current government, the Chinese Communist Party did kind of operate in a balance between factions, and there was debate within the party. And we've seen that over the years. In the 1980s, there was lots of talk of reform. That's what Deng Xiaoping was about. So I do think there are people within the party that do think about the long-term good of the country. We're just not necessarily hearing their real feelings right now.
Еще вопросы? Пожалуйста, сейчас, Глена, I'm sorry. Go hard. Давайте я сам вам дам.
Hi, I was just wondering whether you had any stories relationship between Kazakhstan and China, and if not, whether you're planning to have in the future.
Yes, I have been talking to some people here about the situation for ethnic Kazakhs in China, and a little bit more broadly about Kazakhstan's relationship with China. Kazakhstan is a major partner in the Belt and Road Initiative, and so that makes it very difficult for the Kazakh government to put pressure on China or to criticize how China has been treating ethnic Kazakhs in Xinjiang.
Алина, вы пока вот идете вот в центр, а я даю микрофон Гленне.
Can people in China read your stories?
Yes, the Guardian is not blocked. A lot of the publications that do get blocked they get their Chinese versions blocked. So the Wall Street Journal has a Chinese version, which occasionally gets blocked. The New York Times has a Chinese version that I think is continually blocked. And but some English language publications also get blocked. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation has recently realized that it cannot be accessed within China, but I'm not clear whether or not they also launched a Chinese version last year. So I'm not clear which version it is, but that is interesting because it shows that actually what China's most worried about is the content that reaches its citizens. They don't, to an extent, in some ways, I would say that the Chinese government doesn't care quite as much about what foreign media says about China. They care in terms of how that affects China's image, but the real issue is what information Chinese citizens get, which is in China.
Hi, I have a question. There is a Western approach on that liberal values can feed all of the countries in the world. So do you think that, is it normal in China, or should we promote those ideas as a freedom of speech, for example, or should we just think that maybe we should sacrifice kind of Western values for other things, for greater good in future? So it's rather philosophical than journalistic, but I just want to know your opinion. Thank you.
I don't think it's necessarily my place to say what kind of values I think should be promoted in China, but I think an interesting parallel that I've noticed for journalists reporting in China and some debate in the academic world is this idea in relation to China is this idea of constructive journalism, which to me sounds like positive journalism. Or just positive news. But this idea that we can, that maybe we should focus, and when reporting on China and in China, we should focus on ways of engaging with China and these issues and promoting development rather than criticizing things like human rights or repression in certain parts of the country. Yeah, sorry, that's not really an answer to that.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question about political situation in China. I know that some Chinese citizens who live abroad, they cannot go back home to China because they're going to be killed, arrested, and so on. How can you, as a reporter, help them to avoid this regulation and to return home to China and not be killed? Thank you.
So it's something that I find difficult is that sometimes when you're interviewing people, they will ask you what you can do about their situation or how you can help or what do you think they should do. And really the only thing that we can do is to report their stories accurately and well and hope that that puts pressure on other people with more power to change those policies.
Hi, can you please share an example? Hi, right here. Can you please share any examples? You said that the information space is shrinking in China. Did it affect your specific work in any way? Can you share any examples, please?
Yes, so before when, in 2013 when I was in China reporting a specific story, and then before that when I was there between 2008 and 2010, it was much easier to call a professor or an expert and have an honest conversation about some government policy or some project or something that was going on, and they would say what they really thought about it. And now people will not respond to our phone calls. We've actually been blocked from just calling people just to talk about, fairly inane things sometimes. And then the people that will speak will basically parrot kind of the government's line on whatever the issue is and say how great the government is, how great they're dealing with this particular issue. So that is the way that it's affected my work.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Could you tell us more about the editing policy and overall interactions between the Guardian headquarters, which is located in UK, and your Chinese office? Do they influence on what articles you should write about, or you're kind of more free in your activities?
So the Guardian, the headquarters are in the UK. There's also international desks in Australia and the US. So depending on the time zone, that's who I would be working with. It's a mix of both, so it's up to me to decide and know what are the important stories to cover, and to pitch those well, and why we should be writing about them. And then at the same time, they'll send me things that they wonder if we should cover. But usually it's pretty balanced. It's a conversation.
Hi, Lily, I'm here. Yeah. Thank you for your presentation again. I would like to ask about the situation concerning ethnic minorities. To your knowledge, what are the groups or communities who in China, like locals, who can see the situation not in the way how it is presented in most of the media, but in the way how you present it? And are there any critical propositions to develop this situation, like to somehow develop in a, I don't know, in a way?
Do you mean voices within China that are calling for that change, or?
Yeah, so the voices that see the situation how it is now, and how, the people, groups, communities that can propose some changes to this situation.
Right. So the communities that are affected are not actually, it seems to me that they don't actually have much power to push for that change, because so those are the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, the Hui Muslims, and also the Uzbeks. And there might be some other groups that I'm forgetting. So those are the Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, and then they're also in some other parts of China. And it's very difficult for them to get information out because they're punished just for speaking to people abroad, traveling abroad, and they're pretty scared to, from my experience, they're pretty scared to talk to people if you, as a journalist or as a researcher, go and try to ask them about what's happening. So as for who can push for that change, I'm not sure who that is. I don't know if that would have to be the majority population, the Han Chinese, or at this point now it seems like international pressure would probably be the best.
Последний вопрос.
Hi, hello. My question is about your role. How you feel your role, or like role of your work, in terms of that story what you're telling to the people, wide auditory in China can get because of that governmental blockage, because the story is kind of under censored, right? And so, what do you feel like? So, for what you're working then to depict this story for the history, or to tell them abroad? Like, how you feel this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Sometimes I feel like my motivation is actually kind of selfish. So sometimes I meet journalists who, they do journalism because they want to provide a public good and tell stories that have impact. And I realized kind of a while ago that the reason why I went into journalism wasn't actually that reason. I went into journalism because I enjoy it, and because it's an excuse for me to witness history. And so China's a great example of that. I find it really fascinating and exciting. But over the time, as I've been working in the industry, I've started to think about the role and what our responsibility is. So for me, I do think more about representing that to the West and telling these stories, and trying to get more public attention to things that are affecting Chinese people, regular people, not necessarily just Chinese, that aren't being told widely enough. And some of those stories do get translated into Chinese.
Lily, thank you so much.